Hello, everyone, and welcome to Aanderaa and Bergen, where we're going to have a live launch event of the Aanderaa turbidity sensor. It's a live event, so anything can happen. We're here recording outside of the Aanderaa facilities here in Bergen. And inside of this building, we have our entire staff from Aanderaa, our sales department, our production department, services, support, everyone you deal with at Aanderaa is here. And we're very excited today to be able to present to you our new turbidity sensor. And this is a new way to do it these days. You know, we have been in lockdown for a while, and now we're back in more modern times. And we are launching this virtually for the first time in a live event. While we're going through this event, we'll be talking to some of my colleagues in here. We'll be talking to Mr. Jarle Heltne, who's going to be in the calibration lab. And he's going to talk a little bit about how our sensors are calibrated. On a beach in Sweden, we have Dr. Anders Tangberg, who is our application specialist, and who's going to show us how this sensor is used in a coastal application. And then we're also, at the end, going to take some questions. In charge of all the technology here is Reidun Dalland, and she's going to be taking us through the different views here and taking us through the broadcast today. So just a couple words about the sensor that we're introducing today. The Aanderaa turbidity sensor is based on the optical backbone of the oxygen sensor. We have a long tradition at Aanderaa to make very stable, versatile sensors for the ocean and coastal communities. And the turbidity sensor is the latest addition to the sensor families from the Aanderaa facilities. This sensor is rated can be used in sort of shallow water applications all the way down to very deep waters, in very clear water, all the way down to very turbid water. And Jarle will show us a little bit about how we secure the accuracy of the sensor. One thing that we find is very important to point out, and that distinguishes us from our competitors, is that we are very thorough in our calibrations. We do a multi-point calibration across the intervals to make sure that no matter what sort of conditions the sensor is used in, it is accurate. And some of our competitors, they only do a very brief calibration or check maybe in one point, and thereby cannot really, say anything about linearity of the sensor or how it will perform in other conditions than the point that it's been checked in. We are not assuming anything. We're making sure that the sensor is accurate for all conditions. It is a very robust sensor, as typical from Aanderaa. It's made of titanium, and it has a sapphire glass to make sure it can take anything that is thrown in its way. We know it's rough out there. We know it's going to be out there for very long periods of time. And it is important that it stands up to the test of the elements. So when we head in now, I will hand it over to Jarle Heltne, who's in the calibration lab, and he's going to show us more about how this sensor is calibrated. Over to you, Jarle.
Okay, thank you, Inger. And to all of you, welcome to our calibration department. This is where we calibrate most of our sensor, except from the sensor with compass, because they are calibrated in a special room with low magnetism. But in this room, we do multi-point temperature calibration for all our sensor. We do salinity or conductivity calibration. We do pressure, tide, and wave calibration. And then when I'm heading over to this corner, here is where we do calibrate our optical sensor. So in this special chamber here, we calibrate our well-known oxygen sensor in 40 points. But for this launch, we will of course focus on the turbidity sensor. So all our water quality sensor has also a temperature sensor inside. So since we done doing a multi-point calibration for the temperature, you will also output a high accuracy temperature measurement from the sensor. In this chamber and similar chamber with different size, we calibrate the sensor in different concentration of FDU. So this chamber is totally black inside to avoid any disturbance. So I set the sensor into the chamber, and then we read the sensor, and then we also use a laboratory turbidity meter as the reference. So when I do a couple of points here, I will hand it over to my colleague in Sweden, Anders Tengberg, that will show you how this sensor is used in the field.
Thank you, Jarle. So I'm here on a jetty, which goes out on a sandy beach in south of Sweden. This is a beach where there is a lot of sand transportation along the beach, and I just took up one of the instruments that we use to look at transport processes along this beach, where you have constant movements of sandbars and particles. So to look at such processes and what is causing processes and what are the main driving factors of beach erosion or beach buildup, we here have equipped a Seaguard instrument, multi-parameter instrument, with two turbidity sensors, one closer to the bottom and one higher up. Typically when we deploy, we bury the instrument to half into the sand bottom. And by looking at the gradients here, we can see how much is suspended from the bottom or how much is transported in from the side. So this we combine with current measurements. So here is a single point current sensor, which gives us currents about half a meter or 30 centimeters above the bottom. It also gives us other features like turbulence or how irregular the speed is close to the bottom. And it gives us also acoustic backscatter, which is often correlated with turbidity, but not always, especially not when you have bubbles in the water, because the acoustics picks up reflections against bubbles, but the turbidity sensors do not. Then we also typically equip this type of instruments with salinity sensor. This gives us information about input from nearby river, for example, and how much is water from the sea and how much is from estuarine water from the river. And then another important sensor here is the wave and tide sensor. It's a pressure-based wave and tide sensor, which gives us all the information that we need about waves. It doesn't give us the directional wave, it gives us the wave height, the significant maximal, the wave period, etc. And then what we also often include, sometimes in gradient, measuring a gradient, but as a standard sensor is the oxygen sensor, an oxygen optode. That gives us these sediments are, if you want to look at the biology, these sediments are very reactive. Here, a lot of organic material is recycled. So during daytime, often you have primary production, which can be quite high. And during nighttime, you have consumption. And by measuring this, we get information about what is going on biologically in the sea as well. So with this, I think I will hand over back to Jarle, who will give us some more information about the calibrations, and then I will come back and show you some example of data from previous measurement here along this beach. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. When you visited Anders, I just made a few points with the sensor here, but a full calibration for the sensor take at least 24 hours, covering both the full temperature range and the full sensor range. So when I finish with the calibration, we calculate the calibration coefficient, and they are stored inside the sensor. So when you receive this sensor, it is ready for use. It will then output a finished calculated turbidity measurement in FDU, and in addition, it will also then output the temperature measurement in degrees Celsius. Before I hand it back to Anders, I just will tell you a little bit about the maintenance need for this sensor. There is very low maintenance needs, but since this is an optical sensor, you need to keep the windows clean. This is best done using a brush, a soft brush or similar. But if there is a lot of fouling on the sensor when you recover it, we recommend to put the sensor in a vinegar solution for overnight. Then it will be much easier to clean it. And just make sure that you don't use any sharp object to clean the windows. So with that, I will hand it back to Anders, and we will see if he has got some measurement from his sensor. Thank you.
Yes, it was not deployment from this site here. We just wait for a slide on the data to come up. Thank you, Raiden. So what we have here is a slide of data from a previous short deployment here along this beach. At the top here, you see this beach where I am, and you can clearly see the sandbars along the beach here. And the white flash is here on the top is giving the direction of the currents at this time when we measured. Then on the middle graph, you see 3 measurements. Red is the turbidity sensor, which is higher up. And the blue is the turbidity sensor, which is closer to the bottom. You see that the turbidity sensor closer to the bottom gives higher values, and that's because of resuspension. At the time when we did these measurements, there were much less waves than today. Today it's a little bit more windy and wavy, and there is much more particles suspended in the water. So you can see the gradient there between red and blue. Also the blue one gives you much more irregular values, of course, because you have this irregular resuspension created by waves and turbulence from the currents. Above, in black, you see the acoustic backscatter. So the reflections given by the acoustic sensor here, which also measures the currents. And you can see that it tracks fairly well with what the other sensors are giving. This sensor, the acoustic sensor, is measuring in a much bigger volume. It's set to measure from 0.5 meter until 1 meter away from the instrument, and it's always measuring upstream. It has this upstream measuring function. If you then look at the lower graph, you can see in green, that's the current speed. And again, you see it's quite irregular, and at the time when these measurements were done, the speed was quite low. It's below, typically below 10 centimeters per second, and on average, maybe 3-4 centimeters per second. And you can see also, it's quite variable, and that's typically what you get here. But if you look at the transport, you will see how it goes along the coast. And then at the bottom, you see measurements of the significant wave height, and that should be red on the right scale. It's in purple. And you see waves when we did these measurements were very low. The wave height was typically like 10-15 centimeters. And we see one peak at about 2/3 of the deployment period, and that's from a ship. There's quite much ship traffic out here, and you will see typically these peaks from passing ships, which passes quite far away from the beach here in the straits where we are. Today, I think we would have had about 0.5 meter waves instead of the small waves we had in this deployment. So with this, I think we are ready to answer some questions, and I will give back to Inger here to see if there's some questions came in. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Anders. And I'm up here in the entry of Aanderaa, and here we have a statue of Aanderaa, who founded the company, and commemorating him. We have received some questions ahead of time, and I'll start with those because it is a little difficult on this small phone that I'm using for my shots here to actually see the chat. One of them is for Jarle, and that is for regarding anti-fouling and different types of anti-fouling that you could use along with this sensor, anti-fouling technology.
Okay, yes, anti-fouling protection is very dependent on the location. It will vary from place to place. But we have seen some good results with the different kind of anti-fouling paint, but also using copper tape when you wind the copper tape around the sensor. But for both of these solutions, just remember not to cover the optics, because then the sensor will not work. We have also lately seen some promising result from tests with using UV light. So I think that will also be more used in the future.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jarle, from the lab. And then let's see, there was some question regarding oxygen and its similarities with this sensor. What have we harvested sort of from the oxygen experiences that we've had? And I think that may be more for Anders.
Okay, yes. Yeah, of course. I mean, these turbidity sensors look very much alike the optical oxygen sensors, although this one is 6,000 meter rated and that one is only 300 meter rated. So the backbone is the same. It's constructed in the same way, but of course the measuring principle is completely different. While the oxygen opto uses a foil, which is excited from the inside, and where oxygen comes in contact and quenches the light, the turbidity is a reflection of light against particles, typically mineralogenic particles in the water. So it looks the same, and the processor and so is the same in the sensors, but the measuring principle is quite different.
Okay. Yes, thank you. We also received after one of our previous send-outs that we did announcing the sensor. That's what I want to say is we received some questions regarding a Seaguard with turbidity sensor held up against the Nortec in this case with Seabird or a Campbell OBS sensor. And I think we'd like to just sort of briefly contrast some of them. I think one of the things that we have as an advantage with the Aanderaa instrumentation is that the sensor is can be directly connected to the top end plate if you need to measure in the same point as you're measuring the currents, just like Anders is showing here. And that's with another exciting feature that I think we should bring forward there is that the abilities to actually string along these sensors. So you can make a string of turbidity sensors measuring in several levels above the instrument or below a buoy or however you think is how you need to measure and when you need to measure several levels. And that's quite nice when you need to measure in more than one point and you need to maybe look at the profile of sedimentation and sediment suspension in the water column. Of course, we can also look at accuracies and so on, and we're sort of comparable in many of those aspects. But I do say that some of these sensors, they're not multi-point calibrated in the same type of quality like we do here, where we're offering the quality of multi-point calibration for every turbidity sensor that we send out, which basically means that if you hold this sensor up against each other, if you put two turbidity sensors down next to each other, they will measure the same. They won't always do that from our competitors. Anders, do you have a comment?
Yeah, another point, what you just mentioned, which is important, is the ability to add many sensors or several sensors in different layers, because then you can really see if these are calibrated in the same way. You can see how particles are resuspended. And another aspect where we have used this feature is when we use in deeper waters an acoustic profiler. Then we combine the turbidity measurements at 1 or 2 levels higher up, maybe at 10 meters and 20 meters. This gives us certainty about what type of particles we see on the acoustics and how particles, so by combining you can see, for example, sediments were resuspended by a trawler or by wave action from the bottom because you have a gradient. And then you can see how high up they spread by the acoustics, which gives you more stepless measurement of with the backscatter. So combining these is a really good feature. And here on the beach, we use this to see how sediments are resuspended, and we also use gradient of oxygen measurements, as I said, to look at biological activity, primary production and consumption in these porous sediments. And then we typically put 2 oxygen sensors here instead, and it's just to add them plug and play to the platform. Yes,
great. So I think that will finalize our live transmission, and I will finalize it here with Ivar, Aanderaa, and we will consider the turbidity sensor for launch. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for participating. Bye.